Real quickly, I want to run through a technical factor manipulation problem um, that you may see on the test. So whenever you're changing from one type of grid to another, one ratio grid to another, you're going to have to adjust your technique. So I made a little bit of adjustment up here to the Bucky factors. It's going to be rare that you run across a 6 to 1. So I'm going to make this actually 5 to 1, 6 to 1. The technical compensation for 5 to 1 versus 6 to 1 will be very similar to 10 to 1 versus 12 to 1. It's just not going to be a whole lot of difference between them. So I'm going to make those two the same, and then I'm going to come down and run through this problem here. So technical factor manipulation is always going to be mass, because if you increase your KVP, you increase scatter radiation, you increase scatter production, penetration, you reduce differential absorption, you change the imaging characteristic, and all you're trying to do with grid use is clean up scatter radiation and increase contrast. So since mass manipulation doesn't change differential absorption or the percentage of scatter in the remnant beam, we're going to use mass. And how we're going to calculate technical factor manipulation between two different types of grid or two different ratios of grid, it would be new mass is equal to the old mass, the mass you originally used, times the Bucky factor for the grid that you are going to, divided by the Bucky factor for the grid that you were coming from. All right, so word problem, a pediatric patient needs KUB. He measures with thickness that would call for a technique of 80 kVp at 36 mass with an 8 to 1 grid. As a pediatric patient, we would like to use lower patient dose. So what new technique could we use to lower the patient dose? And since we're using, we've got a selection, we've got an 8 to 1 grid is what we used. We're going to go down to a 5 to 1 grid. So we're going to use the formula new mass is equal to old mass times the grid ratio we're going to, divided by the one we're coming from. So what we're coming from is 3, what we're going to is 2. So it will be new mass is equal to 36 times 2 divided by 3. So 36 times 2 is 72. Divide that by 3. And our new mass for the 5 to 1 Bucky, or 5 to 1 grid, would be 24. And whenever you're working these, consider, because you're going to have a tendency to want to flip these around. This portion of the formula is inverted for whenever you change screen speeds or image receptor speeds. The formula is identical. It's for changing image receptor speeds. It would be new mass is equal to old mass times from over 2. So you're going to have a tendency to flip those two around a little bit. Just remember that anytime that you go up in grid ratio, your technique needs to increase. Anytime you go down in grid ratio, your technique needs to decrease. So if you were to have flipped that around and said, used the Bucky factor of 3 for the 5 to 1, Bucky factor of 8 for the 8 to 1, or if you just got confused and went, you thought the formula was old mass times from over 2, consider, well, I went down in grid ratio, so I need less radiation. But if you'd have flipped that around, it'd have been 36 times 3 divided by 2 would be 54. So if you were to decrease your grid ratio to 5 to 1 and suddenly you're using 54 mass, then your image is going to turn out way too dark, or it's going to be darker, or S number, your index number is going to show that you used too much radiation. So old mass times 2 over from.